name is Luz Maria de Regil. I'm the Chief Technical Advisor with Nutrition International. I will start with invite Dr. Purnima Menon, the Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI, and she has ample experience in the programs, particularly of Alive and Kind.
Thank you. Thank you, Luz. It's such a pleasure to be here at the second session that's been organized by the Society. I have no conflict of interest to declare with relation to my work, so I'm just going to go on to give the framing talks. I was asked to sort of offer reflections on opportunities and challenges with respect to integrating nutrition into other sectors, and rather than take a data perspective, I decided to step back a little bit, and I offer reflections that are coming from a review that James Garrett, Sunita Kadyala, and Neha Kohli did for our engagement around supporting the government with how to think multi-sectorally for nutrition in India, and my own experiences as part of that, and engaging mostly with the government of India and helping them think about what kinds of things they may need to do and think about if they want to act in multiple sectors to improve nutrition. Some other experiences here are coming from designing and engaging with impact and process evaluations of some of these integrated programs. So you'll hear insights that are coming from a few of these different areas. So I want to first start with saying, well, why do we even care about other sectors? We've all seen the UNICEF conceptual framework and things like that, and I think for us it's because poor nutrition outcomes are really the outcome of women and children and poor families living in extremely challenging environments. I like to bring a pictorial slant to the UNICEF conceptual framework in speaking about that, because to me, this woman that I met in UP, which is a poor state in India, sort of really embodied all the challenges of what it means to live in a challenging environment, and for us to think about what will it take for multiple sectors to change what happens in that home for that mother and that child in that time and in that space. I think this is what multi-sectoral programs are at the end of the day trying to do. So this is a woman who was a young woman, was pregnant and was very young and had clearly a stunted child, and what we are trying to do is to support her to execute better things from a nutrition perspective for her household is the things that happen in her immediate context for her and for her child. So those immediate conditions of food and feeding, of care and hygiene, what happens when her child falls sick, what happens because she herself was already back in the 1,000 days after having a child who's 18 months old. But to recognize that what happens in her immediate context is really sort of situated in the rest of her life. What does her home look like? What does her food security look like? So to me, the UNICEF conceptual framework and how we think about that is really embodied in the lives of these people. And what we need to think about when we think of multi-sectoral programs is how do you change that? And how do you support those people who live in these challenging circumstances to do and to be able to do the right things for nutrition? So this woman for me is a bit of a North Star, talismanic kind of person that I like to keep her in my mind and in my slides, because it helps me think about what is it we are trying to do with these programs. We have a strong empirical basis for doing it as well, of course. I mean, many of us have been working on stunting and trying to understand, what drives change over time. And I look over and over and over again, multiple studies, multi-country work by Lisa Smith, Lawrence Haddad, the Brazil studies, several now different pieces of work being done by our colleague Derek Heady and other collaborators looking at what factors drive change in stunting over time. This is very different from us trying to intervene and change the outcome, but those keep pointing to those sort of underlying drivers such as women's education, food security, assets, equity, income, health services, and it really forces us to think of the fact that this is what we are trying to change. These are the things that create different conditions for child growth for those women and children. And multi-sectoral programs, to me, sort of acknowledging that there are gaps in many of these drivers of nutritional outcomes, in addition to what we know to be gaps in the coverage of nutrition interventions and more specific interventions. And these gaps are different in different places, and sometimes even different for different people across and within different places. And that thinking multi-sectorally to improve nutrition is the fundamental goal of that really is to change and to close those gaps so that those conditions change faster than if we weren't thinking with that nutrition lens. Now, if you go to the Lancet Nutrition series of 2013 and the second paper in that series, Marie Ruel and Harold Alderman very nicely laid out 3 different approaches for making sectors do more for nutrition. The first one is that the sector simply has to address the underlying determinants, that is the core mandate of that sector. So if you work in WASH, you have a core mandate to improve WASH, and that in itself should lead to, should be supportive of nutrition change. If you work in agriculture, you have a core mandate to improve the availability, supply, price, reduce the prices, etc. of foods. And so that's approach one, sort of, is the sector doing what it can and should do to address sort of its core sectoral mandate? And by doing that, do you then bring equity for all those women and children out there? The second is that the sector itself really integrates nutrition goals and actions into what they do. And I think a prime example here is agriculture. If the prime goal of agriculture is to produce food, if you're not producing or not keeping a nutrition lens to what the sector is doing, then you end up where we have ended up in many countries, which is that cereals are being produced and are very cheap, but nutritious foods are not. So what does a sector like that needs to do? Some very tricky things. And the last one is the use of the sectoral platform to deliver nutrition-specific interventions. And I sort of want to posit to us as a group and to challenge us to say that we have really ignored a lot of work on approach one. A lot of the work that people have been doing in terms of thinking about integration or the role of other sectors has been in this space between approach 2 and approach 3. And I think it has led to us forgetting a little bit that the core goals of those sectors have to be meant to change the conditions in which children grow, and we need to keep putting pressure on sectors to do their basic jobs. Each of these different approaches, therefore, really requires a different kind of thinking from us in terms of implementation, but also in terms of research, of how do we do the research that tells us whether these things are moving and flowing in ways that change the conditions in which children grow. In the work that we did in India, we spent a very long time actually doing this review and trying to put together a definition of working multi-sectorally for nutrition, which I want to share with you. So the definition that we used and that we continue to use in engaging with people there is that the goal of working across sectors for nutrition is to work more comprehensively, to bring all of these resources and actions in different sectors to bear at the same time, in the same place, on the same child, if your focus is child malnutrition. So you have to think geographically, co-location, maybe integration. But the idea being that we really want to bring it to bear on the same time, same place, has been a real driver of how we engage with people in government and in other sectors to say, if you fix your agriculture thing this year, and then you start to think of nutrition behavior change next year, and you haven't yet dealt with sanitation, you've already lost children that are growing through those 1,000 days, for example. At the same time, when you think about this integration, I think we've moved a lot to integration, which is in fact at the sort of most extreme end of the collaboration continuum in working across sectors. So the beginning point for working across sectors, and this again is from James Garrett and Smita's work and authors that they've cited, is the networking. So are we exchanging information for mutual benefit? Are we coordinating then to either alter activities and achieve a common purpose? So this is where, for example, the approach to kind of working across sectors would be in the coordination and cooperation and collaboration part of the continuum of working across sectors. My sense is that in nutrition, we have moved very quickly to the integration side, of this collaboration continuum without having fully worked out in several cases what needs to happen more upstream of that collaboration to create the commitment and sort of the intent to do what needs to be done. So I want to close with saying, what is this kind of thinking of what you're trying to achieve with the multi-sectoral approach, which is that we have women and children in these vulnerable age windows. We know that there are big gaps in the multiple drivers of malnutrition for those women and children, and our job is to try and bring it all together in that very narrow window and closing some of those gaps that really either create or don't create enabling conditions for children to grow in. So in the space of integrated programs, so these end up being sort of somewhat NGO-led implemented programs that, where it's a little bit easier to bring together different sectors to do the same thing at the same time. What you see is geographic co-location is already a given, so they're not talking about doing agriculture here and wash there and social protection somewhere else, which governments do a lot of. You're seeing huge emphasis on programmatic integration. You don't see, I think, as much of a focus on approach one, really asking the question of actually are we changing the core determinants on the ground, and then are we addressing that from a nutrition sensitive? You'll often find, for example, with water sanitation discussions around hand washing, which haven't yet fully addressed other gaps in sanitation, etc. So it's moving, but it's a little bit slower. I think it's more focused on approach 3 and approach 2 and approach 3, and really on that integration end of the collaboration continuum rather than on the upper ends. These are challenged often by sectoral expertise. You don't often in a certain NGO or programmatic world have all your sectoral expertise fully in place, so there's quite some struggles there, and they often become over complex and difficult to implement. Very difficult to evaluate. Our survey questionnaires, when we try and evaluate some of these integrated programs, have started to become enormous because we are really trying to figure out all the things that people are doing. But more importantly, I feel from where we are trying to take this in terms of getting the world to think about changing determinants, multiple determinants on the ground, that sort of complex integrated programming model is very difficult to scale. And potentially difficult to sustain. So that I think we should really think hard about. Now, the other side of the work we do is really thinking about government actions, and so in the interactions and the engagements we're having, the opening conversation or discussion really is, okay, can we at least move towards geographic integration or co-location? And I'm really pleased to see, for example, in this case, where the Indian National Nutrition Strategy is going, which is it has acknowledged the role of 3 sectors. It has acknowledged that the programs or the vertical programs in those sectors are often in different districts, even in terms of focus or high burden districts. So they've decided that these core of 100 districts, 150 districts, are really going to be core co-location districts, and so we are talking about geographic convergence. And their next steps are to say, how do we now use data to get to what they're calling programmatic convergence. But I think that when you're working with sectors and line ministries, geographic integration or co-location is likely going to be much, much easier to achieve than programmatic convergence. There are very strong sectoral lines of action across government. And actually in some cases even within governments. If you look within ministries, if you look within the health sector, for example in Bangladesh, you have 2 very different line departments, and they don't really talk very much to each other. So I kind of, in the review work we did for India, I think it was quite interesting to see that in health, they talk about intersectoral coordination inside health. And here we are trying to get people to coordinate outside. I was in a meeting with someone on child development in India and saying, we really have to talk about gender and women for nutrition. And he was like, oh yeah, those other people in the other room. And then with the next breath says, I'm really not talking in silos. And I kind of went, like, really? But this is the reality of how governments work. And I think if we don't acknowledge and work with that reality as champions for nutrition, we keep trying to get governments to do more. That is really not easy or well set up for them to do in the first place. And so within government and within large-scale government programming, I think approach 2 is maybe easier, but approach 3, which is to really get them to think about delivering nutrition specific in their sectoral mandate, is really quite difficult and likely unsustainable. So in closing, I want to say that, for effective integration, we have to make a huge investment in diagnostic work, because what you want is all people to see the problem the same way, to recognize where their sectoral lines and mandates actually come together to help that, to see the gap that exists, and then to come to think about solutions. My worry is we often start to talk about solutions before people have gone through the diagnostic process of understanding, why is WASH important and how big is my WASH gap, how do I close that, and then also do it in a way that's nutrition sensitive. And once we have that agreement, then I think we know the ingredients that need to be in place. That malnutrition is given top priority, that the authorities create political space, that there's a common language, that we share in identifying solutions, and really institute the kind of coordination that gets you to the goal of effective action to reach all households in that critical window with all of those actions. Thank you.